Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. We are delighted to have you join us here today. Please be informed that if you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the question box in your control panel. The presenter will answer your questions at the end of the presentation accordingly. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenter, who will begin shortly.
Welcome, everybody. This is the fourth session. As you probably have seen also in the previous ones, we had quite a few interesting sessions on the ISO 27701, the newly launched PIMS system. So I was quite happy that we got another invite actually from PECB to dive a bit more into the roles and the functions which support these information management and privacy management systems. While preparing this session, actually, we got quite some news. And for example, in Belgium, we had quite some hot news actually on court decisions, and the Data Protection Authority in Belgium made quite some controversial decisions regarding the assignments of the DPO. And meanwhile, a few weeks ago, we had some court decisions also in the Netherlands, where the CISO or the contractors were convicted actually for mistakes that were made. So it's quite a hot topic, and I think that certainly now that over 2 years the GDPR is in place, quite some more DPAs, data protection authorities, start taking their roles seriously, or they have everything in place to take it seriously. And this is quite an interesting feed and food also for thought actually for this session. So right, what we will do for today, we will talk about the role separations between the CISO or any equivalent IT roles, security roles. We will talk about the DPO and also very important, the auditor roles, because that will kick in also for the next few years probably, that your compliance and your data protection will be evaluated for some reasons, for compliance, for customer demands, for vendor demands, and so on. And one of the questions also in these roles is how to combine CISO and DPO roles, and I will refer back actually to the case that we had in Belgium, for example, on not separating or separating the roles depending how you look at it. More important also is what are the conditions to make it work. And last but not least, we will also talk about the auditor part of that one, meaning what is the role of the auditor in this case? What can he or can he not, or she can or cannot do in that sense? And I hope that you will have some background information to implement all your information management or data protection management properly. Right. So let's get started. The usual stuff as first. We will not go too much into detail because I have quite plenty slides actually to cover for this hour. You can easily find back my profile and Stephen's profile, I think, on LinkedIn. We both have been certified in ISO and data protection, and also I'm teaching for PCB quite some courses also in this area. So. And plus, both of us have quite some hands-on on implementing and evaluating and doing the audits for this system. So this is quite the ideal session for us to give you some insights how it works. Right. You will see that the slide deck also will become available after the recording, as usual for the previous sessions. Both the recording and it will be shared. And you will also see that on SlideShare the PDF versions will be available for reviewing afterwards. And last but not least, it's a packed session. There's a lot of people actually joining on this one, and usually there's a lot of questions. We will not have the time to answer all of them, but we make it a good habit actually to collect the questions. And you also will find a collateral page actually on LinkedIn where we actually answered the questions all one by one. So I would invite you actually to look at LinkedIn. We will repost the links, of course. And also, based on this collateral page, you can also visit the previous sessions, including slide decks and audio for that one. Right. Why is this topic so important? Before we got into GDPR, we had typical discussions in IT security, and when you ask companies in how IT security should be handled or information security should be handled, and you know the difference between of them, I will not talk to it in detail. Most of the companies or even management business pointed actually at the IT operations department actually for getting that security fixed. And almost by nature, it was pretty obvious that IT should take care of the security operations and guard them in that sense. For a bit larger companies or smaller companies with some extra support, they had the legal department available just in case it went wrong, or in worst case scenario in previous history, then when you had a data leak, then the lawyer jumped in, or with some legal assistance you could fix it. But there was no really connection between IT, legal, or business. Well, they were not really concerned about security, and well, they were happy if it worked well, but when it got wrong or data leaked or the business lost money on a few things, then the finger was easily pointed at the CISO, or even worse in IT. One of the things at that time, just before the crisis, I will point out in a few slides actually to that one, security was not benefit for the company. It was easily to estimate the budget needed for implementing security correctly. And certainly at that time, 2010, 2008, data protection was not that hot or not looked at, although that many legislative parts already existed for quite a while. For example, in Belgium, our privacy laws come from 95, so it was there, but it was not looked at. And the accountability was actually not pushed that much, and that's where, for example, GDPR changed a lot. But although you will see that the first change was at the financial crisis. We had a pandemic approach also on that one. We had the bank crashes, lots of things, and what happened at that time is that to avoid happening it again, there were a bunch of financial regulations, requirements for compliance boosted a lot. Because of that, audit requirements boosted a lot, and this is also, of course, a main driver to start implementing frameworks, guidelines, best practice like the ISO, like the PCI DSS. There were quite another regulations actually that started getting active in that sense. And in that time, you will see it actually that all these roles from data protection, security management caused quite some people to jump in, and the point here I'm trying to make is a lot of roles, a lot of definitions, different interpretations. We had privacy officers, data protection officers, security officers, internal audit, GRC, which is governance, risk and compliance became important because of these legislations, and of course the legal officer, legal department were still there. Right. How do you organize this is not always a fixed answer to this, and we will not be able to hand you over that exact regulation or the exact way of organizing for your company, because every single situation, every single setup of company is specific. So we can give you some general guidelines, things you do and do not need to do in that sense, but depending on your organization, the size of the organization, your specifics in the way that you're working with the company, regulations, local regulations, national regulations, international regulations, you need to reorganize a few things, and that requires quite some specific expertise and knowledge and experience. And we will point out, for example, this is a very important question, for example, for the DPO role, which Stefan will explain later on. Second thing is, one of the things that is very difficult if you have an existing organization, in most of the cases, changing that to appoint accountability, or appoint responsibility for a few things is quite difficult. People need to change, and that is not always easy. And to build in your security, and that's one of the main goals, certainly for the ISMS system, and certainly also for the PIM system, so the 27701, is you need to change the company from a TIM to make this work. And in reality, we'll see that implementing this kind of implementations, setups and so on is painful. That does require quite some support from management, and there's one human nature in that sense, is that people hate changes, certainly if they feel threatened for their job. If you have been doing quite some identity and access management systems implementations, you will see actually it's quite heavy actually to explain people that they're not losing the job, but they need to do their job correctly, that the impact is actually bigger and bigger over time. Certainly, if management only sees costs for these implementations, compliance costs money, IT security costs money, and they don't see the benefits in long term, and only companies that have been suffering from incidents or having been breaches, and I will show you a few in the next slide, will start to understand why you need to have that implementation. And certainly in Belgium, for example, if you know that 99% actually of our national product, national revenue actually is coming from small companies, one of the typical feedbacks you get is how do we organize this? How do we set a DPO? How do we hire a CISO? Our company is too small. Can't we do it in one job? And then you start discussing about conflicts of interests, and this is where I'm with reference to quite a few hot decisions from the DPA and court decisions. So you will see there is quite some pressure actually to still do it right. Another part is certainly difficult, is the lack of expertise and experience. It's nearly impossible to have all this experience and expertise in your own company. So at a certain point, you must decide, do you want support from externals, some contractors, and so on. So this is also one of the evaluations we will touch actually during these sessions. And last but not least, the lack of courage is to make the change, to speak up, to detect incidents, and to use these incidents and opportunities actually to start moving. One of the companies actually involved in the articles I will discuss in the next slide, didn't speak up, and then they got an incident, and then actually the legal part comes in. So it's important to take the courage to build your case and make a good business case and to start making the change. So if you don't do it yourself, you will see actually there are quite some articles, and I just did the quick search actually for the last few days, and let me show you a few of the examples which I found actually in the news for the last few days. The Belgian DPA actually sued or actually fined, did a fine, and by the way, that is quite interesting. It got quite some views also. The enforcement tracker is a website actually that tracks all the decisions that DPAs or court cases get in regards to data protection. The case here is that a company, quite a large company, actually failed to appoint a DPO, and what they did is that actually they combined the role of risk manager with a DPO, and that got into attention of the Data Protection Authority, and actually they decided, well, there's a risk actually for the protection of the subjects which cannot be guaranteed to have the proper protection, so you need to split this, and actually this turned out to be quite a hefty fine actually for this company, so 50,000 euros in that sense. So immediately, and this is the second post as a reaction to that one, and Tim van Kanheid is one of my fellow auditor, fellow trainers also on data protection. He actually worded it quite well, is also from the risk management and the compliance and the management side, is should we still do that DPO job? Is it still possible to, in a normal company, being a manager, to have the job as a DPO? So it's a real good question, and this is a bit of a look of the other side. So this caused quite some havoc, and lots of companies actually reconsidering the assignment of their DPO. So have a read about it. And again, I mentioned it. I just did a quick lookup. I can imagine that if you look into the rulings that you will find on the European Union, you will find more of them. Quite some companies in the European Union have become very active in filing these cases and so on. So we see the results after 2 years now popping up. Another one I wanted to point out for you is concerning the topic of the day, including the CISO roles, is that actually a company got convicted and has been, there was a court ruling where a company was supporting, so it was a contractor company supporting a customer which failed to implement quite some protections, and more specific in this case for ransomware, the backup failed, the backup got infected. I don't want to go too much in detail because of course it's very specific, but it does. It is a sign on the wall in that sense that actually that you need to take your responsibility and accountability very seriously. And just a few days ago, I found also a case, and that's what you see on the right-hand side here, is that a woman, and this is a police case actually in the UK, by the way, where actually what happened is that a businesswoman or a system administrator left the company, and she managed actually to get access to some online files, and I think in this case it was Dropbox, and she completely wiped the Dropbox. So this is also one of the concerns, and also your life as a CISO is not becoming more and more easier, and on the contrary, certainly with the cloud business we are boosting right now because of COVID, your life is getting difficult in that sense, right? So that's the part of the discussion what I wanted to show you, and this is actually the core reason that I think this session can be quite interesting, and we will try to give you some practice hints and tips actually to make sure actually you can implement it. And that's also why we wanted to make sure that how can you separate these roles, how can you implement them correctly without getting into trouble even in the future. What we will focus on is a CISO role, so in essence information security management, and as we explained also in the previous sessions, the link between information security management and data protection is of course very obviously and very obvious in that sense, and the ISO 27701 will help you actually to implement it correctly. One important thing is the DPO role. So certainly with the launch with GDPR now 2 years ago, a bit more actually as 2 years ago, it has become very obvious that you need to do something with that data protection management. And please also remind that GDPR is not the only one. We have quite some international legislation now boosting up CCPA, American legislation, US legislation, international legislation also in other parts actually of the world. GDPR or data protection in general becomes more and more important. If you want to prove that it works, and in some cases it's mandatory also for compliance to prove to your customers, vendors, or even the government, you need to plan for security audits. And what we will discuss here is the internal board as the external audit on that one. And Stefan will cover that one in the next slides. Right. First of all, before we go into detail on the discussions, quickly, some definitions here, where CISO stands for Chief Information Security Officers, is a broad interpretation of the role itself. What we mean right here is being responsible for information security management, and in most of the cases, this CISO or Information Security Officer is guarding the company obligations, only company obligations, and company internal, even if you would consider it as CISO as a service, which is also one of the new things that pops up quite regularly. The accountability or responsibility lies within the company and on the operational security part. The DPO in that sense is actually a sort in between, not acting on behalf of the company, but acting on behalf protecting the subject rights. So there's a major shift in responsibility here, and this shift will cause that DPO and CISO combination is not always ideal. And second thing is a major difference between DPO and CISO is that the DPO tasks and responsibilities are actually written down in the GDPR, so there's not a lot of escape here. The definitions are set in stone. There is a bit of interpretation there, but that's, for example, not the case for a CISO. Another one, a bit from outside operation part, is the auditor. And what we are looking at right here is, of course, within the ISO environments. So the International Standards Organization, there are quite some standards that require some audits. What we're talking about here is ISO 27001 and the 27701. These are auditable. Please be aware that actually these audits are also based on ISO 9000 findings in that sense. And in essence, the main goal of an audit and the role of the task and the role of an auditor is a compliance control. But please be aware, and we will explain in detail, that actually is not only about compliance, it's not only about policing, saying it's right or it's wrong, but also the auditor should allow you to understand what you should do, improve. But so there is a point that an auditor can provide you some of advisory, but the link between advisory and consulting is very thin, and that's what we will explain in later slides. First, and more important also, the auditor will push you actually to continuous improvement. Remember what we explained in a few sessions already, is that the ISO is based on the PDCA cycle, and we will push you actually in the clause 10, for example, ISO 27001, to continuously improve. And there is a major task here for the auditor. And also there's an internal task, meaning internal audit, the authority and the responsibility lies with the company. And if you're talking about external audit, which is mainly targeted at certifications, so what we're focusing here during this session is purely on information security audits, not financial ones as referred before in previous slides. Right. Good. Next part will be for Stefan. Go ahead, Stefan.
Thank you, Peter. So hello, everybody, also from my side. I'll talk about first about the role of the DPO. So if we move to the next slide, there's been a lot written and said about the DPO, the Data Protection Officer. I think at first you have to see, when is it necessary to actually have a DPO? This is fairly, let's say, it's documented in the GDPR legislation. Basically, there are 3 cases in which you need a data protection officer. The first one is fairly straightforward. The moment that the processing is being carried out by a public authority or body, okay, they need to have a data protection officer. That's plain and simple. If you look at the second reason, that would be when your core activities, either if you're a controller or a processor, consist of processing operations, which require regular and systematic monitoring of data subjects on a large scale, then we also expect that there is a data protection officer. And the third reason is when you would do this processing of on a large scale of special categories of data. That means religious data, ethnic origin, political opinions, memberships of trade unions, biometric data, health data. In that case, you also need a data protection officer. Of course, here, if you read this, we're talking about a regular systematic monitoring. It has to be large scale. It needs to be, let's say, a part of the scope and the purpose of the organization. So that doesn't give you a clear view on when to appoint a data protection officer. The Working Party 29, now the European Data Protection Board, they wrote some guidelines on how to interpret this, but it's still, let's say, it's still discussable either when you need one or not. Local authorities also published some lists where they think you need to have a data protection officer. But I would say the moment once you process data out of category of Article 9, being the sensitive data, don't doubt, make sure you have a data protection officer appointed. When you are more, let's say, in a commercial activity, but you do a lot of email marketing, SEO, you have a lot of cookies in place. There also, I would say, okay, you do regular and systematic monitoring on a large scale. So also make sure there that you appoint a data protection officer. Look, moving on, it's important that what's the qualification needed? And there's not really one specific document stating this needs to be the qualification of a data protection officer. But it's a more generic approach there also in the legislation, where it is expected that the designation is done based on professional qualities of the person. What does that mean? It means he needs to have knowledge about the data protection law, and I would say laws, and also practices that come with it. So what does that mean in practice? If we move on, we'll see. It means, first of all, it can be somebody internally, a member of the staff of the organization, or it can be also somebody from outside of the organization. In this case, there needs to be a clear service contract in which it states what the responsibilities of this external DPO would be. If we look on expertise, the expertise depends a bit on the tasks of the data protection officer. So even these tasks are clearly defined in Article 39, and I think it's important to look at them. The data protection officer has at least the following tasks. So there could be more. But what does he have to do at least? First of all, he needs to inform and advise the controller or processor and the employees on obligations they have in line with the regulation. So it's a role of creating awareness in the organization, both, let's say, with the management, but also with the employees, so that they understand what their role is in complying to the regulation. He or she also needs to monitor compliance with the regulation. That means like checking, monitoring if the assignment of responsibilities is done correctly, if there is enough awareness raising in the organization, are the staff involved in processing actually trained to do the job? Do we check if we are in compliance, check the results of the audits, perform audits themselves? In some cases, it's an advisory role. When data protection impact assessments need to be done, the data protection officer advises a team of staff members that are actually doing this data protection impact assessment. It's not his task to actually perform it, but he helps, he gives advice, he looks at things from the legislative aspect. He's a spokesperson, the cooperation point with the supervisory authorities, and also the contact point for them when issues occur. The data protection officer has to also watch out. He has to have a due regard to the risks associated with the processing operations, looking at the nature, scope, context, and purpose of the processing. So he has to help the organization in thinking about risks that occur when processing personal data. We can move on. What is not the responsibility of the DPO? First of all, organizing the information security. That's why you have an information security officer. Organizing the data protection. It's not the responsibility of the DPO to implement technical measures to protect data. That's for information security guys. He's not accountable for the data breaches. The accountability remains with the organization. He just has to monitor if all the technical and organizational managers are in place to prevent the data breaches, but he's not accountable. He's not responsible for performing the risk management and the risk assessment. He has an advising role there. He can help think about it, point out risks, threats, or vulnerabilities, but the risk management process itself is not his responsibility. It's not his responsibility to implement privacy by design. That's also for the development guys, but he can create awareness so that the developers know about it. So taking all of these elements into account, is there an ideal DPO? What qualifications do you need to be the ideal DPO? I think there's a lot of things you need to have expertise of. First of all, you need to know the business of your company. And you need to know the company you're working for. What are they doing? What's their core processes? Why do they process this data in relation to their strategic goals. So this business expertise is important to understand what the purpose of the data processing is, so that you can look at it the right way and give the right advice. You need to know the legislation. If it's only in Europe, you need to know the GDPR. If you go worldwide, you might need also to know other specific local privacy legislations. So you need to have some view on this legal aspect. You need to know about compliance, governance, risk elements, compliance element. So also there, you need to understand how an audit goes, what is expected from risk management. Of course, the data protection, what technology is there in the market, so that we can see how can we protect our data in the best way. Information security, what are the good practices there, so that you can also give advice on protecting this personal data. And of course, I think that's for every function, you need to stay up to date with what's happening in the world. So you need to have a broader interest to get enough information on new security techniques, on new technology that is available. So it's a big chunk of things that you need to have knowledge of, which makes it challenging to have a DPO. If that's not enough, we also expect people to have soft skills, because they have to convince management sometimes to follow their advice, to get openings with people in the processes, to show them what is actually done with personal data, so that they have a good project management view in big projects. They need to be good communicators. They need to educate people. They need to have a certain authority within the organization, so that they can enforce certain things. Behavioral skills. You need to, make sure that the people in the company keep the discipline in respecting the procedures and policies that were set up. Of course, incident management, when it goes wrong, he needs to have the cool to handle the incident in a correct way. Closely linked to that is business continuity, disaster recovery. So also there, again, a whole set of, let's say, soft skills and experienced skills that you need to have to be a good DPO. Can you do this in one person? I think that's a big question to ask. It depends on your activity. It's a big difference if you're a hospital or if you are a B2B mail order company, for example. So it depends a lot on what kind of personal data that you have, what you process, to decide, can we have one person covering all of the knowledges that we know, or is it better to work with a DPO office where we have a group of people with expertise? It could be a data protection officer with a legal background. There can be a data protection officer with a more cybersecurity background, another person more specifically to software development background. So it could be different people with different backgrounds all together being the DPO office. It's not required that the DPO is one person. It can also be a group of people. This could be a group of people from intern within the company, or it could be people from outside the company, external DPOs, or a hybrid situation where you have a mix of both. What does the Data Protection Board put in their guidelines? First of all, they say, like I said, if you doubt if you need a DPO, is it large scale or not? Is it systematic or not? When in doubt, it's safer to assign a DPO. Make sure that the DPO has involvement in all issues related to data protection. So that means that there needs to be an open culture in the organization to involve the DPO early in the projects, in the process, so that he or she has a good view on all the data that is being processed, and that he can advise in doing this in the right way. The DPO needs to have the necessary resources. So he needs to have time. He needs to have tools, maybe even, to perform his job. So that's important. And the fourth one is really important. It has to be done in an independent manner. The DPO cannot be under control or cannot have restraints within the organization when performing his or her job. So this independency is very important in the role. That's what Peter said earlier. The first cases came out now where companies are fined because this independence could not be shown. There's also a regulation on dismissal or penalty for performing DPO tasks. A DPO cannot be penalized, or a contract with an external DPO cannot be cancelled because he was performing the tasks that he needs to do. So there is a form of protection that you can do your job in an independent manner. Watch out with conflict of interest. This will become more and more an issue. A lot of DPOs have other roles within the organization, and we see that the local authorities are looking more and more in these conflict of interest roles. That's why when you're a CISO, that's not the same, not the ideal position to also being the DPO. So watch out there for those elements. Also the data processing by a DPO. So when you're performing your tasks, you also process data. So that's also something to pay attention to when you're in the role of a DPO. So what are considerations in choosing an internal or an external one? We listed some. There are pros and cons for both. If you go for an internal DPO, of course, the advantage is you know the company. You work there, you know what they do, you have a good insight in the processes, you can have a direct impact. If all goes well, you're in a good connection with management since they appointed you, and you can have an internal multidiscipline team to support you. And since you're always there, you have a good high availability. This is, of course, depending on the percentage of time you would have as a DPO if you do other tasks. What's the disadvantage? You're an employee, you get paid by your boss, so you really early in the situation have a conflict of interest. So you could have also a lack of authority if you're the Chinese volunteer being appointed as the DPO, and you don't really have, let's say, a good position within the company to have people listen to you. And you might be a bit in, let's say, a perception that, are you responsible for data protection or information security? It's so closely linked that they might have a perception that it's more on information security than it is on data protection. So you could get into conflict there. If we look at using an external DPO, the advantage there is if you get an external guy, he costs money, so he more quickly has an authority as an expert. And external DPOs see a lot of different companies, see a lot of different situations. So by nature, they bring in a certain expertise because they are more in, let's say, practices with different business sectors, different companies from which they can pick out the good points and bring into your company. You can also have an external DPO office where they have multiple DPOs with multiple backgrounds. So you get more knowledge coverage using an external firm. And you have people not being in this tunnel vision of your company. They look at it with different eyes. They don't have, let's say, this form of normality that you might have if you're an internal DPO, that you say, okay, we've been doing this for 20 years, it's normal. External guys look at it more as from an outside perspective. They would challenge you maybe more on some elements. Of course, there are also disadvantages. They don't know your company that well, so it might be more difficult for them to see the whole flow of the data processing, to have these all nitty-gritty details that you as an internal person could know. So that's a challenge. They might not be available all the time. If you need a certain expert and he's in another project, he might not be available for your project. They have less accountability. They make a contract. The accountability is limited to the value of the contract. So that could be a disadvantage. And of course, you need to transfer data with them if they do offsite work. So there you would also need a good processing contract. So there are pros and cons for both. It's something you need to consider depending again on the type of data that you process, what would be the best solution, and also on the competences that you have in-house, the size of your organization, and the expectations that you have of the role as a DPO. All right.
One of the next steps, actually, as discussed at the introduction, is also looking at the CISO roles. While you had quite a good overview, actually, on the DPO roles, which in main case, certainly for GDPR, is well defined. It's not always the case for a CISO or a similar role, and you might even see it in the naming and certainly in the profiles being used overall. Make a search on LinkedIn or on the internet, you find actually the similar roles, similar names, the different things to do. And one of the things that you will see influencing that use of that name is of course the point of the position of the hierarchy actually that the security officer is taking in the company. As mentioned in the intro, in most of the cases, IT security is linked to operational stuff, and of course, you can realize a lot of security practically, but having the opportunity to improve things is not always there. The influence to make the company change in the DNA of the company is not always there. And departmental CISOs is a C-level IT officer, IT manager role, what I'm talking about. So in most of the cases, they do have an influence to management, although not making the final decisions. Lots of argumentations on budget, on influence, and costs, and so on is that part of that role. And of course, the most influential part is the really C-level discussions. And I see more and more companies, for example, using the C-level security officer, and that's where the CSO comes from. There's not only information security, but and also explained, for example, in the ISO 27001, there's a lot more than only information security, physical security, people safety, and so on can be covered in that sense. So if you integrate information security as part of the company security and safety, you have a very powerful position and tool actually to start moving the information security into the DNA of the company. Another point here, although there are lots of people think that security should be part or is part actually of IT, it's not always the case, and there might be some interesting options actually to select a different department. For example, simply organizing a security department. Certainly, if you have some additional tasks in physical security, it might be a very interesting option to integrate both of them in a separate department that offers quite some independence. We will discover in the next few slides a few options, and I hope you get a few food of thought actually to reorganize in the best way information security for you. And risk and compliance is another one, as I explained in the beginning of the session. Due to the fact that lots of companies now have GRC compliance obligations, you could actually put in your information security in that part. And moving it really to the business, making them responsible for information security is also an option. And of course, remember that in planning an ISO 27001, the first thing you need to talk about is to the business and the importance of information security for them. But in that case, it might not be always optimal actually to get it implemented. So because they haven't any clue about legal and risk compliance, IT department. So there are a few things you need to check, and where you would position this is very important. Second thing also, and now I'm moving a bit into the slide decks also from the ISO courses because they're very fun actually to explain a few of these concepts. On the strategic level, you really talk about board level, C-level, director level, upper management. The capability to decide and to move on the company is very interesting. Usually they lose the connection in the operational part of that one, and that's where the tactical department, the tactical level comes in. As mentioned, the department level. They both need part of actually of the implementation of information security, but the real foot on the ground is really an operational level, and that's actually also where the courses like the ISO 2701, the 2702, and also risk management will explain a few things, right? One of the typical old-fashioned ways of doing, or the practical ways of doing, is actually putting the information security as part of the IT, information technology part, support part of that one. Is that you are very operational thinking, and so you see a lot of things happening, but one of the major advantages in this case is that the budget is in there, and if there's any stress or resource planning, then you will see actually that keeping the things running become important, and the first thing that will drop actually from the budget is security. So there's a risk actually that due to pressure on your budget, actually security is less implemented. Another way, and of course making separate information security department is very interesting. So you can actually leverage the independency and making security as part of the business. The disadvantage in this way again is that the department is separate, it's not integrated in IT, so you have a separate level of discussions, and IT will make the budget, so it takes some time and some knowledge. And again, as Stefan discussed, the same thing applies also on the knowledge level here for the IT security or the security officer, is that you need to know the business, you need to know the drivers, you need to know how the business runs. So you need to talk different level of communication, so you're stepping away from technical discussions more into business or even risk or even legal discussions. So it's different kind of operation, different as what happens in IT, but you have certainly some advantages to keep it separate from the operational part. Are there any other options? Yes. For example, internal audits, or you could put it into legal, pretty close to what DPO is doing, or you could put in the company operations. The main risk here is that you're not thinking data protection, you're not thinking about technology, you're not thinking about operational part of that one. And I've seen quite some companies that integrate information security or general security actually in different departments. But then the distance to operational implementation becomes even bigger, and the language being used might be an obstacle actually to get proper implementation in that sense. It depends on the size of the organization. Larger organizations do have these opportunities to reorganize and to set separate departments of that one, and to separate actually the actions on that one. And certainly for companies, as I mentioned already, that are worried about security or have security in their DNA, protection companies, airport regulations and so on, they might think of having a CISO, security Chief Security Office implementation. And the good news here is that you get a direct link also in that office to the CEO. You can change a lot of things from a top level and build in security directly in the organizations, right? In contradiction to the DPO, there are no strict guidelines for governance, actually, how to organize your CISO role. What you can still do is look into the guides and the standards, like the ISMS or the PIM system right now, or PCI DSS, and certainly GDPR, because they still point, although indirectly, to quite some principles like security by design, separating environments, and so on. But from a regulatory point, a legal point of view, GDPR does not demand for a CISO in any way or any role or any expertise in that sense, and that makes it quite difficult. Again, be aware that security in most of the cases is important for performance, important for budget, and so on. And as mentioned before, one of typical behaviors is that if there's any stress on the budget or performance, one of the things that will actually be cut immediately is security, and that's one of the things as a CISO I think you should be very much aware of and try to stop that kind of approach. If you can make it a benefit that you have security on board, later on you will have a nice business case to defend it, right? Also be aware dismissal or penalty performing of CISO roles. Of course, I've taken this line actually from the DPO. While there is some legal protection from the DPO side, there's not for the CISO. I've been doing quite some tasks where actually you point out some security points or some breaches, whatever, and you always risk as a CISO if you pinpoint actually these pain points to the CEO or someone who's to blame, some of the cases, that you might risk your job in that sense, and there's very little protection in that sense. Again, also one important thing, most of the cases the CISO is actually acting on behalf of the company, and the DPO is not, so he's acting on behalf of the subject in this case, and this is a different position. That's exactly where the conflict zone comes in from DPO and the setup. We already referred to the Data Protection Board advisory. There's also a very interesting fact for frequently asked questions actually that discuss this. There are a few attention points that you should look at is how to choose this, and in essence, if you look at the advice, is make sure that actually you look at the functions and responsibilities. Again, this depends on every single enterprise, so it's not a general rule, but if there are any tasks that are incompatible with the function of DPO, like independence, like defending the subject and so on, or if there are any reasons that you can't combine it, be aware of that one. And that's exactly one of the reasons I showed you these news items. Actually, it is becoming a major attention point for the DPAs. So in this case, same thing for the rules. Again, for DPO versus CISO, make sure you have some internal rules how to avoid conflicts of interest. What do you do in a case of conflicts? Some major rulings or management decisions to be taken, in what kind of level you can guarantee independence for the DPO versus the CISO, right? Also, internal ruling, as you see right here, is not always from a technical point of view, so you need to have some policies and so on. And very important, also from an HR point of view, if you hire a DPO as internal or external, make sure also the roles are very clear. So there's an HR responsibility in here to make sure that how data protection and expertise, for example, is being described in the vacancies for that one. Right. If you look to these cases, in essence, what they say and the decisions of the DPAs, and in that sense, clarify a lot. So yes, you can combine DPO and CISO functions on operational level, fine, but not on a management level. And for example, the case I mentioned by the Belgian DPA says, well, if you have a management function, you need to make some decisions on the company level. You can't combine that with a DPO, and that's actually one of the clues you could look into the case. I've included the references on that one, and if you look at the Belgian DPA decision for finding that a DPO, then you will find more details on that one, right? So mainly look at the conflicts of interest. Certainly for smaller companies, it's not always easy. And try to find out in advance a bit what you can or cannot do and make some clear agreements on that one with the management. And due diligence in that sense, of course, and having processes, policies in place will help, right? Make sure you separate the DPO from management functions, from operational security data protection functions, and make sure you get a proper setup for that one, right? Last but not least, to conclude actually sessions is a bit of the audit things, and then we'll hand over the word again to Stefan briefly for allowing us still to discuss this and then answer a few questions for end of the session.
Thank you, Peter. So audits, why would you audit? I think it's a good tool. It's a good tool for compliance check, to check if you're actually doing what you're supposed to do. It keeps security in line of the business. And what I find really important is that continuous improvement. Standing still is going back. So you need to keep this continuous improvement rolling. And audits are a good tool to push this, to check this, and make sure that it keeps running. If we look at audits, we can have two types of audits: internal audits and external audits. Peter already mentioned in the previous sessions that we had, what's the difference between an auditor and an implementer? And how can you use both of them in your benefit? When you're implementing an information security management system or a PIM, it's good to also think about how this would be audited, because it will help you implement it in the right way. What we're looking for as auditors is we need to see results. Make sure that you set it up result-based. There needs to be output of your process so that we can see that the process is working. We also look really, let's say, in the real activity of the processes and not just checking off the not just ticking off boxes. That's important. It has to look at the broader perspective. Growth mindset. And it's not perfect at the first step. Rome was not built in a day. You have to start somewhere. It's better doing something that is not perfect yet, but gives a start, puts the fundamentals down, and then move from that. So you can act small, but think big. And we can go on. We have to look at time a little bit. A view of an auditor will help you to implement this PDCA, this plan, do, check, act, keep this improvement going, doing it step by step. An auditor needs to have an independent view for both internally and externally. And he has the helicopter view because he can have a look at all the different processes, all the different activities from above, let's say. So some practical hints. I would say include audit considerations from the start when you set up systems, when you take measures, when you go and protect your data. Involve auditors throughout a project like that. If we look at internal versus external auditor, okay, that's an end stage. He brings the cherry on the cake. He makes sure that you are in conformity with a standard. You get a certificate to prove that. That's your target. While an internal auditor, that's differently. There you go more and look for improvement inside. You look at you do cross checks, cross departmental. You cannot audit your own processes. So it's a different role as an internal auditor. Can go on, Peter. Use the external auditor also as an advisor. He's not just there to check off requirements. However, he cannot be a consultant. So he has to watch out for conflict of interest. There are guidelines on that. I'll briefly go through them. Basically, when I'm an auditor, I cannot be your consultant. That means I can look at your processes. I can point out opportunities for improvement, but I cannot give specific advice that you have to use this or that tool or put up this form in this or this way. I can just give you general elements to help you improve your system. When I'm an external auditor, you can take a training course with me, but it has to be general. I can be your external auditor, but not if I was a previous employee of your company. There we also say, okay, it has to be at least 2 years between a consulting job or an employment position within a company to be able to audit you. I have to be independent. There cannot be any conflict of interest. So that's important. That's covered in a standard, the 27006, to which certification bodies have to adhere. So that's briefly on the conflict of interest part. I think we're pretty much coming to the end. Impartiality, I talked about that. It's important. Get the audit lifecycle. We had that in other sessions. You start with an initial audit, get your system in control, get these fundamentals laid down, start building maturity, and in the surveillance audits, which you have it in year 2, year 3, there we check, is the company still in control? Do we see improvement? Does this maturity level increase? And then in the recertification, when you get the new certification cycle, we again go through all of the processes to make sure that everything is still in line with the requirements.
Good.
All right.
That means that a bit of a speed up at the end of the session. Again, the presentation will be posted, so you will have a look at the slides, a bit more details, because the references for the audit, meaning the 2706 and the 17021 is quite important to maintain that independence, and the audit will become more and more important role. Also mentioned on European level, for example, there is new legislation coming up that will certify services, people, and so on to make it more cyber secure, right? Ardian or Albana, they want to take the word?
Yes, thank you, Peter and Stefan, for delivering this very informative and detailed webinar. PECB offers training and certification courses which will show your dedication in implementing and managing privacy-related frameworks And most importantly, you will get recognized worldwide. Now, before moving with the Q&A session, I want to inform you that in addition to all the available PECB training course delivery formats, PECB has officially launched its first e-learning dynamic training courses as well. For more information, please check the video link on the chat box that I sent you. Now we'll go ahead and take some time to answer some of the questions from the attendees regarding today's topic. Please be informed that due to time limitations, our presenters will answer 2 to 3 questions. However, after the webinar, we will make sure to send you the link where you can find all the answers to the questions during the live session. So I'll continue with the first question. Can the CISO also take on the DPO role? And is it necessary to have both of these functions? Peter or Stefan?
Yes, as mentioned, can you combine it? Yes, but one of the main conditions, as referenced exactly in the slide, is the management role, right? So if you have any responsibility within the company, any manager function, you get in quite a danger zone. And the case that we have now within Belgium, and it's not the only one, by the way, shows actually that the combination of a DPO with manager functions is a dangerous combination. Do you have to separate them? No, certainly within smaller companies you do. You have the opportunity actually to do them together, but then make sure, and as also pointed out in the hints and the tips, make sure you have a proper policy, you have a good explanation, that you know exactly where the lines are, what the segregation of the duties is, and keep aware actually that the definition of DPO and the responsibilities are clearly defined actually in the GDPR, for example, also in other legislations. So, okay.
Thank you. The second question and the last one for today is DPO required to have technical knowledge on how the data is stored, transmitted, and safeguarded, especially in IT systems, or is the knowledge of laws and regulations good enough?
Shall I take that one?
Yeah, go ahead, Stefan. I just want to point it to you.
Okay, thanks. So I think just knowing the laws and regulations is not enough. As a DPO, you also need to have some understanding of how data is stored in systems. So you do need to have some knowledge on cryptography, on how data is stored, cloud security. Do you need to be an expert in it? Do you need to be able to implement such a thing? I would say no, but you do need to have knowledge about it, because otherwise it's very difficult to look for it, to give advice on it. So yes, I think you need to have knowledge on also the technical elements of IT infrastructure.
Okay, thank you, Stefan. Because of the time limitation, we'll have to conclude the session. Thank you, Peter and Stefan, again for this remarkable session, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Please be informed that this session will be recorded and posted on our website and YouTube channel along with the slides of the presentation. For more information about our webinars or the PECB store, please visit our website on www.pecb.com. Thank you all and stay safe.